psychotherapist, I come to the themes of this conference from a rather different place. And I want to begin by telling you a story set back in the late 19th century. Two elderly sisters are living out their lives of simplicity, poverty, and abstemiousness within a small Lutheran community in a village in Norway. Their father, long dead, used to be dean of a religious sect, and any sign of luxury, worldly comfort, or fleshly satisfaction is condemned. Food is sparse, clothes are simple, and life consists in good deeds and works of charity. And they're helped in their house by a French maid, Babette. And neighbours who are puzzled by the presence of such a woman in the house assume that it is the sisters' piety and kindness of heart that led them to employ her. But as we are to learn, the reason for Babette's presence in the house of the two sisters is to be found further back in time and deeper down in the domain of human hearts. And so begins Isaac Dinneson's beautiful parable, Babette's Feast. The story then goes back many years to a dark and stormy night when the sisters are interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. It's the shipwrecked stranger, Babette, who's escaped the communal uprisings in Paris and is now a homeless refugee in need of help. The sisters take her in, they feed and clothe her, and subsequently ask her to work for them as a maid. And for 12 long years, Babette patiently cleans the house and cooks their simple, tasteless food. She gets to know the dean's dwindling elderly flock. She hears all their quarrels and difficulties. She says nothing. And then one day, like manna from heaven, Babette hears from her cousin in France that she's won 10,000 francs in the French lottery, and she insists that she would now like to cook the sisters a meal to celebrate the centenary of their dead father. They reluctantly agree, and Babette starts to make her preparations, sending off to France for the wine, the food, and the crockery, and even a live turtle arrives for the turtle soup. The sisters have never seen anything like it in their simple lives. They don't want to upset Babette, but in a secret meeting with the dean's disciples, they agree to attend the party and eat Babette's food, but true to their Lutheran ways, neither to taste nor to enjoy it. And so, as many of you will know, the centrepiece of this wonderful story is the evening where Babette serves up a fabulous feast of French food and wine. Her signature dish, caille en sarcophage, is recognised by one of the guests, and we learn through him that Babette was once a famous chef who cooked for the great and the good in Paris. And during the feast, we see how her delicious French food wonderfully and comically transforms everyone present. Lifelong quarrels and disagreements melt away. The villagers are all reconciled with each other. They are transfigured. After the meal, the sisters go to thank Babette, assuming that with her winnings she'll now want to return to France. But instead, they learn to their amazement that she has no more money. She's spent her entire fortune, the entire 10,000 francs, on the meal for them. And so Babette remains in the sisters' house, continuing to serve them as she's always done. I don't think there's anything I can say to you today that begins to come close to conveying what Dinneson's sacramental imagination tells us about the essence, the practice, and the meaning of hospitality. It's a parable about the importance of welcoming the stranger or the foreigner as harbinger of the divine, about the presence of the sacred in the everyday, about God walking amongst the pots and pans, I think St. Teresa of Avila once said. And so I want to use Isaac Dinneson's story as my inspiration for sharing some thoughts with you about hospitality, its importance as an ethic and as a practice for our clinical work, and within public sector service. So let's start with the word itself, which is not one that's generally included within the psychotherapeutic lexicon today. Hospitality has its roots in two Latin words, the first of which, hostis, carries the dual meaning of both host and stranger or enemy. The host is the one who lays down his or her weapons and welcomes the stranger in a mutual relationship of trust. But hospitality also has its roots in the related term hospes, which contains within it the root word pot, meaning master, from which we get potestas, or power. And so hospitality also contains within it the notion of power. The host is the master who has the power to welcome or refuse foreigners or strangers into the home. So hospitality is rather a curious term, containing within it its own antithesis. For hospitality is never a given, never guaranteed. It operates on the knife edge of hostility. When faced with a stranger, the foreigner, do we open or do we shut the door? Do we say yes or do we say no? Do we reach out a hand or do we reach for the sword? Derrida uses the term hospitality to underline this hostility that's the ever-present shadow side of hospitality, a violence that always threatens to break through. This duality is most obvious in the kind of hospitality that Derrida calls conditional, perhaps the only kind of hospitality that we really know these days. Hospitality within the law, one that serves to maintain or advance power structures, practices, and hierarchies. Hospitality is qualified here. An exchange takes place between host and guest, where any welcome is conditional. The host, first of all, needs to identify the stranger and asks him or her certain questions. Who are you? Where do you come from? And then demarcates the extent and limits of the hospitality on offer. You can enter, but you mustn't harm my family. You can stay for 3 nights, not 4. You can eat this food, but not that. The laws of hospitality are ultimately bound up with notions of sovereignty, which determine rights, laws, limits, and liabilities. Absolute hospitality, on the other hand, is, according to Derrida, both inconceivable and incomprehensible. This kind of hospitality is unlimited. It remains outside the law, outside conditions, duties, debts, or exchange. Absolute hospitality calls us to the table before any entrance exam, freely sharing, without question and without condition. The language of hospitality, says Derrida, appeals to the other without condition. Absolute hospitality, he goes on to say, requires that I open up my home and that I give not only to the foreigner, but to the absolute, unknown, anonymous other, and that I give place to them, that I let them come, that I let them arrive, and take place in the place I offer them, without asking of them either reciprocity or even their names. So absolute hospitality breaks with the idea of hospitality as a duty or law. It can only exist as unlimited, without debt or exchange. If hospitality is conferred as a duty, I am not, says Derrida, fulfilling my duty to God. There's an impossibility, isn't there, about this kind of hospitality, one in which the host gives way to the stranger. Babette Cease stages this absolute hospitality as the sisters give way to Babette, reversing roles so that during the feast she cooks for them, they become guests in their own home. And this giving way to the other, I think, constitutes the very interruption of the self, the decentering that Derrida sees as the hallmark of absolute hospitality. I think it's very close to Levinas's idea of the subject as hostage to the other, where one's sovereignty and authority gives way, indeed has always already given way, to a substitution of the self for the other in a relation of responsibility. Of course, the host who maintains absolute hospitality will end up being overrun and thus losing his or her position as host, even his or her home. And so for hospitality to be possible, paradoxically, there has to be some kind of mediation between absolute and conditional hospitality, a dialectic engagement between the two poles that Derrida calls the double law. He says we need to calculate the risks, yes, but without closing the door on the incalculable, that is, on the future and the foreigner. It defines the unstable side of strategy and decision. In other words, despite their conditionality, there have to be thresholds, boundaries, or laws in place to ensure the home is used properly and that it remains under the aegis of the host. But these conditions must, in the name of absolute hospitality, be carefully calibrated, because for Derrida, conditions violate the individuality and singularity of the visitor. Laws reduce otherness to the same. There's a violence in this. And one of the things that Derrida is interested in is how to negotiate this double law, how to renegotiate conditions for this particular guest, for this particular individual. As if, he says, the judge himself invented the law in every case. No exercise of the law can be just, he says, unless there is fresh judgment. Hospitality, he says, consists in doing everything to address the other, to accord him, even to asking his name, while keeping this question from becoming a condition, a police inquisition, a blacklist, or simply border control. The difference is at once subtle and fundamental, but an entire politics depends on it. An entire ethics, he says, is decided by it. The French existentialist philosopher Gabriel Marcel brings something a bit different to our understanding of hospitality. He suggests hospitality first and foremost marks the act of receiving. To receive is to admit and welcome an outsider into one's home. Marcel says if we devote attention to the act of hospitality, we will see at once that to receive is not to fill up a void with another's presence, but to make the other person participate in a certain plenitude. And this lovely word, plenitude, seems to have something to do with the personal generosity of the host. For hospitality, says Marcel, is a gift of what is one's own, i.e. of oneself. To provide hospitality is truly to communicate something of oneself to the other. So, in hospitality, we communicate something of ourselves, and Marcel suggests two important concepts here: presence and availability. Presence, he suggests, is the remedy for what most afflicts people in the modern world. It's a way of listening, a means of receiving the other. Whilst it can only ever be glimpsed, it's easily recognisable. Presence is something, he says, that reveals itself immediately and unmistakably in a look, a smile, a tone, a handshake. Presence and absence are not at all the same thing as attention and distraction, however, since the most attentive and conscientious listener may give the impression of not being present. The truth, says Marcel, is that there's a way of listening which is a way of giving, and another way of listening which is a way of refusing oneself. So closely allied to presence is the notion of availability or disponibility, as he says. The person who is at my disposal is someone who is capable of being with me with the whole of him or herself when I am in need, while the other, who is not at my disposal, seems merely to offer me a temporary loan raised on his resources. For one, I am a presence; for the other, I am an object. We acquire presence for one another through availability, a kind of porousness, a willingness to put ourselves at the disposal of another, to receive him or her as a mystery rather than a problem. And this distinction between a problem and a mystery is central to Marcel's ontology. A problem, he says, is something which I meet, which I find complete before me, but which I can therefore lay siege to and reduce. But a mystery is something in which I am myself involved, and it can therefore only be thought of as a sphere where the distinction between what is in me and what is before me loses its meaning and initial validity. A genuine problem is subject to an appropriate technique by the exercise of which it is defined, whereas a mystery, by definition, transcends every conceivable technique. It is no doubt always possible to degrade a mystery so as to turn it into a problem, but this, says Marcel magnificently, is a fundamentally vicious proceeding. So a problem for Marcel is something that requires a solution that's available for everyone. It presupposes a shared community in which something can collectively be discussed, formulated and solved. In order to do this, there has to be a level of abstraction so that we can remove ourselves from the particularity of the situation to arrive at general concepts which allow us to reach a solution that works for all. Our capacity to do this is obviously very important. But, says Marcel, our understanding of the world cannot be fully captured via the use of concepts alone. It involves a mystery in which, says Marcel, I am myself involved. What is in me and what is before me loses its distinction. We are immersed in context, says Marcel, and many of our experiences are mysterious. They intimately involve the question in a way that cannot be reduced to abstract conceptual ideas, because this would only serve to cut the individual off from the situatedness of his or her experience. Perhaps we can see a relationship here between Marcel's concept of mystery and Derrida's concept of absolute hospitality. Derrida asked us to relate to the other without conditions and without the law, such that we sustain the particularity and uniqueness of the guest without subsuming him or her into an aspect of the same. Similarly, receiving someone as a mystery rather than reducing them to a problem ensures we are hospitable to his or her specific individuality and distinctiveness. In both cases, it seems to me that hospitality requires a stance of thoughtful, involved, and generous attentiveness to the other as an individual. If we turn to the NHS, I think we can see that nowhere is hospitality more clearly symbolised. The state's offer of hospitality towards the old, the sick and the vulnerable, that promoted a sense of relief and healing in a country that had been through 2 world wars, is still powerfully felt and even still reverenced today. It's an offer over which we can and still do hold our governments to account, and indeed probably the best measure of this is the fact that politicians of all parties know they'll be judged more on the health of the NHS than on the health of their citizens. However, despite its apparent presence and availability, the NHS market for care increasingly suffers from a lack of hospitality of the kind that I think Marcel and Derrida propose. We're all very familiar, and we were hearing about it really this morning, weren't we, how the stranglehold of market principles, now firmly embedded within public sector services, ensures the hospitality of the state towards its citizens has become ever more conditional, ever more exclusionary, ever more restrictive. Within NHS mental health services, this ever-increasing conditionality is incarnated by the escalating emphasis on standardisation, proceduralism and regulation, which places thresholds, boundaries and limits on what types of therapy, for whom, to what extent, according to what principles, what criteria, and for how long certain individuals, groups and so-called diagnostic categories may be permitted to participate in and benefit from psychological help. Marcel sees such abstract conditions and standardization, or tendency to classify and categorize, as the principal means by which strangers remain strange to us. Derrida too sees abstract generalization as a kind of violence that quickly overwhelms the concrete reality of the individual before us. For Marcel, the categories we assign to the other prevent us from being fully available to their presence. They become a problem to be solved, not a mystery in which we ourselves might become implicated, involved, engaged. Hospitality, in the Marcellian sense, means we must be willing to be with the stranger, experiencing him or her as fundamentally unknown and unknowable, rather than reducing him or her to an abstract problem requiring impersonal care and management via the use of techniques or strategies. As Winnicott says, a baby can be fed without love, but impersonal care and management cannot succeed in producing a new, autonomous, human child. Techniques and strategies, of course, are only part and parcel of the wider audit culture in which clinical services are funded on the basis of complex networks of governance intended to represent and quantify clinical outcomes, service activities, and the service user's experience. And this creates what's been called an auditable surface to our clinical work that's subject to continual surveillance, monitoring, and evaluation. It's what we might call the triumph of the visible, a greedy capture of everyone and everything under the net of numbers. And this requirement for visibility, of course, has to do a lot of work within the institution. Certainly, it reduces everything to a quantifiable problem, but I don't think that's all it does. I think it does something far more subtle, far more pervasive, and far more damaging. To my mind, it charges or loads an institution with a particular quality, a quality of what we might call surplus or exaggeration. It creates a climate of what I call caricature. And it's this quality that indexes what the late John Berger calls the theatre of indifference. Now, John Berger was very interested in this quality of caricature, which he saw as a particular feature of contemporary urban life. Berger thinks of public life as a theatre in which we're all required to be either spectator or performer. The continual emphasis on visibility, on presentation, suggests Berger, begs for some kind of attention or judgment. But the judgment here is not, as it used to be in the case of the famous political caricatures by people like Max Beerbohm or George Cruikshank, a moral judgment. The performance is not there to highlight issues of power, hypocrisy, difference, or social justice. The performance is not there to shock us, because I guess nothing shocks us anymore, does it? Rather, the performance is there to distract from, occlude, or smooth over any inconvenient truths. It's there a bit like Facebook to convey a narrative of achievement, success, and progress. Judgment in the sense of critique is not required. The judgment this performance requires is judgment simply about the success or failure of the performance, about maximising output, about whether people keep watching. So the player must cultivate an exaggerated mode of being, involving compulsive hamming it up, hyperbole, and overstatement. But with the success or failure of the performance at stake, there's huge anxiety, suggests John Berger, that no one's really interested. Perhaps the audience will simply get up and walk away, and this redoubles the effort to perform, to be visible, to ensure more output. By contrast, the spectator's experience is that the performance is utterly irrelevant to his or her situation. Either the spectator stays to watch the show, performing indifference or boredom, or he departs with a show of cynicism and distrust. Occasionally, he or she will applaud, performing some kind of acknowledgement. In this enactment of mutual indifference, Berger suggests we often play both parts. Sometimes we perform a refusal to perform, we're part of the silent majority perhaps. And at other times we might perform performing, we'll participate but with rolling eyes, so to speak. What's missing, says Berger, are two things. One is the possibility of silence, a state associated not with thoughtfulness or creativity, but rather with the abject failure to retain an audience. So silence becomes confused with indifference and seen as something entirely negative or shameful. The second thing that's missing, Berger suggests, is any sense of productive labour and any sense of real power or agency. These take place elsewhere, offstage, as it were. The historical precondition for the theatre of indifference, says Berger, is that everyone is consciously and helplessly dependent in most areas of their life on the opinions and decisions of others. To put it symbolically, the theatre is built on the ruins of the forum. Its precondition is the failure of democracy. The indifference is the result of the inevitable divergence of personal fantasies when isolated from any effective social action. What does Berger mean by this? I think indifference here refers to a kind of collective passivity that's the inevitable result of a consumer culture peddling the rewards of individual progress, personal choice, and personal responsibility. I think it's probably fair to say that we're all consumers now. We're no longer a society. We've all been reduced to a disconnected bundle of individual data generators. We are intent on, centred around, focused on our own futures, our own prospects, our own goods, our own health, and our own wealth. And we perhaps too easily assume that others, authorities, are best placed and best equipped to plan, offer, and provide hospitality and care to the sick, the elderly, and the vulnerable. It's others who must make the decision to provide relief following accidents, floods, oil spills, terrorism. This helpless handing over of agency is what Berger suggests underpins the failure of democracy. It's also what he thinks sponsors a theatre of indifference, in which he says appearances hide failure, words hide facts, and symbols hide what they refer to. Certainly, in the NHS Today, presence has become a matter of presentation. Availability has become a matter of accessibility. Clinical work is now not simply therapy, it's best practice, something that's increasingly identified within a published manual or protocol. Identifying a need within a local community doesn't simply require commissioning, it requires world-class commissioning. Of the competitive discourses of evidence-based practice, the exaggerated claims of politicians in the media, the imperative of guidelines, standards and competences, Baudrillard might say, there can be no language more impoverished than this one, laden with reference, yet empty of meaning. Individuals, says Irving Goffman, are concerned not with the moral issue of realising these standards, but with the amoral issue of engineering a convincing impression that these standards are being realised. Our activity then, he says, is largely concerned with moral matters, but as performers we do not have a moral concern in these moral matters. As performers, he suggests, we're merchants of morality. Our day is given over to intimate contact with the goods we display, and our minds are filled with intimate understandings of them, but it may well be that the more attention we give to these goods, the more distant we feel from them, and from those who are believing enough to by them. One of the tensions within our work within the public sector is certainly the felt drive to engineer a convincing impression that guidelines, policies and protocols are being realised. Indeed, as performers in the theatre of indifference, I think we've become merchants of mental measurement, and we preside over a glittering display of virtual commodities. And many of you will know what I mean when I say GAD-7s, PHQ-9s, Core 10s, phobia scores, work evaluations, satisfaction questionnaires, diagnostic categories, mental health clusters and activity monitoring, all specified, operationalised, calculated, quantified, evaluated and uploaded onto a computer for immediate statistical analysis. I've said elsewhere these technologies of representation in the NHS and the discourses used to describe them generate a level of excitement, energy and financial investment that could only be said to constitute a fetish. Fetish, of course, is itself constituted by performance, but one that, as psychoanalysis tells us, hides or disavows something. Going back to Marcel, we could say it hides a lack of human presence and availability on which a meaningful ethic of hospitality depends. And without that ethic of hospitality, all we have is show, sham, performance, and illusion. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah came to me for psychotherapy within a specialist secondary care psychoanalytic service, and there's no doubt she was referred to me because she was a very difficult patient. She'd been through many NHS services, she'd made many complaints, some at a very high level. No one was helping her, she said. No one could be bothered. Service after service politely told her they could do no more for her. And so the psychiatrist under whose care she'd been placed phoned me up in desperation and said, look, Rosie, could you please see her for psychotherapy? There's really nothing else we can offer her. So, that's how she came to me. Sarah was in her 40s, born in Pakistan, and subsequently brought to the UK when she was 3 by her parents along with her 5 siblings. As a child, she lived in Lancashire, and she told me a bleak history of continual abuse, neglect, mockery and violence within the family, where she felt herself to be the particular target of her father's physical and emotional hostility. She was beaten, jeered at and put down. Her father forced her to fight with her brothers, her mother beat her with a broom, and she was expected to cook and clean for the whole family from a very young age. She was never encouraged to work or to plan for her future. Her parents had just assumed she would get married. School was terrifying. As a Pakistani Asian girl in an entirely white school in 1970s Lancashire, Sarah was picked on, bullied, ridiculed and teased. Nobody took her side, and often the teachers joined in with the abuse. At 16, she left school and enrolled in a further education college, only to drop out less than a year later. She said she'd always been told there wouldn't be any jobs anyway. Eventually, she managed to get a job in the local car factory. This was difficult, exhausting and unrewarding work where she was subject to continual racist abuse, bullying and taunts. An accident left her face badly burned, and after 5 years she left. She subsequently attempted a degree in social work, but sadly this too failed as she was unable to manage the academic demands of the course. Sarah's mother arranged for her to marry a man in Pakistan, a man whom Sarah thought of as backward and uneducated. In fact, it turned out he had learning disabilities. Sarah was shut in a room until she agreed to marry him. But when they returned to the UK, she divorced him, and she told me that her mother continually blamed her for this. Sarah never had any other relationships. She was unable to get a job and was not in receipt of any benefits. After her father died, she continued to live with her mother and brother, both of whom she had extremely angry and aggressive relationships with. And she told me repeatedly and angrily that it was all too late now. She desperately wanted to find a home of her own, but it was never going to happen. And this narrative of homelessness became a recurrent and vivid theme in our work together. I don't have time today to tell you the whole case, but I wanted to tell you about one little detail that's always stayed with me. Because Sarah often spoke about the mess and dirt in her house. She said that her mother and brother would never clear up and keep the place tidy, so she'd retreat to her bedroom. But there it was too messy and there was nowhere to sit comfortably. And one day I decided to ask her more about the bedroom retreat, and she proceeded to list in great and heartbreaking detail the various small household things she had collected over the years and stored in her room. Saucepans, frying pans, bed linen, cushions, an electric kettle, cutlery, crockery. She told me she'd always bought things for the home that she thought she would one day have, for the meals she thought she would one day cook, and for the family she thought she would one day bring up. Most of these things, some dating back over 20 years, had never been taken out of their boxes. Some 4 or 5 years previously, Sarah had been told by her GP that the NHS would now be able to get her a job. She had waited patiently for her 6 sessions of counselling at her local highly publicised IAP service, of which the GP had spoken in glowing terms. In return, she told me bitterly, she'd agreed to fill in, and I quote, all those bloody forms like a good girl. She'd then been referred to their employment advisor. After a wait of some months, she received a letter telling her that the employment advisor was leaving. Frequent abortive telephone calls and a complaint to the head of service eventually resulted in a third letter, which told her there would be a replacement employment service in due course. 18 months, many furious phone calls and 2 formal complaints later, Sarah arrived at the newly configured employment service, only to find that she would be offered help in writing her CV. For someone as deprived and angry as Sarah, this was hardly what she'd been waiting for. She had believed the rhetoric, and she'd assumed, wrongly, the service would be in a position to actively get her a job. She'd assumed at last she would be finding work, at last she would find a use, a home, for all those pots and pans. She believed every word of what her GP and the NHS services had said, and yet for her, their words were indeed laden with reference, yet empty of meaning. I came to realise over time that the repeated offers of help from the NHS seemed to symbolise something of the hospitality and sense of belonging that had been so terribly missing for her. Sarah didn't want to be housed, she wanted a home. A sense of home was not only missing within her angry, aggressive and frustrated family, of course, it was also missing in the prolonged hostile and racist reactions she encountered in a small Lancashire town where her family settled after arriving from Pakistan. Their difference, their foreignness, was certainly not welcome there. And so perhaps it was inevitable that the offer of psychotherapy from the NHS, perhaps the only offer of hospitality she'd ever truly received, should trigger enormous feelings of longing, loss and rage. In response to the unstoppable story of cruelty, ignorance and missed opportunities that Sarah brought me week after week, I was only able to offer a listening ear. But listening seemed to open up entrenched feelings of anger, grievance and disappointment that in the end became unbearable for her. The last straw came after Sarah's many complaints to the head of the Mental Health Trust eventually resulted in a formal response. In this letter, which she loudly and with shaking hands read out to me, the head of the trust agreed the NHS had indeed failed Sarah and apologised. It had failed by not telling her, they said, 4 years previously, that she was in fact entitled to a free bus pass that she could have used to get to her sessions with the employment advisor. The letter concluded by telling her how she could now go about applying for this bus pass herself, and it kindly included the online link. Perhaps it's not surprising that shortly after she received this letter, Sarah disappeared suddenly and without explanation, never to return. Perhaps she was unconvinced by what I had to offer. Perhaps for her, therapy was just theatre, an implausible performance aimed at masking what she might have felt was to be my failure to care and my indifference to her suffering. When I subsequently thought about the referral, about how Sarah was sent to me as a last resort, and how I seemed from the outset to have been deployed merely to keep her off the psychiatrist's back, perhaps therapy had indeed been something of a show. It was certainly a failure. When I look back, I think I felt overwhelmed by the scale of her problems and what I felt was my inadequacy in the teeth of such obvious deprivation. Perhaps I came to embody the uncaring figure of the head of the Mental Health Trust, imposing the impersonal, indifferent rules and regulations that dictated how she was entitled to no more and no less than an online application form for a free bus pass. As Derrida suggests, there's real violence in this application of the universal to the particular. Hospitality, he says, performed under these conditions is no hospitality, since it's performed unwillingly and therefore without smiling. Perhaps it would be fair to say that in the NHS, the ancient ideal of hospitality has been appropriated by the marketplace and converted into the hospitality industry, which offers an appearance of care, conveying only an impression of goodwill, masking barely concealed inequalities and antipathies. Here's your online application form. It's what we might call a thin version of the kind of robust, profound and intensely complicated attempt at hospitality proposed by Derrida and Marcel. It permits at best only a deeply conditional welcome to the other that's predicated on exchange and recognised by both parties as thoroughly and irredeemably transactional. And I couldn't help thinking about all those bloody forms given by Sarah in exchange for therapy. Indeed, this thin hospitality is currently proliferating exponentially with the opportunities afforded by mobile phones and social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. Our hunger for presence and availability is being met by an NHS moving decisively towards mental health apps, online consultations, e-bookings and digital diagnosis. But these, I think, are simply a distraction, inessentials indexing the virtual presence, the counterfeit availability that underpins, permits and sustains the theatre of indifference. There looks to be less and less space for a shared experience in which the therapist makes room in her mind and heart for the client, becoming implicated in the very concerns that bring him or her to therapy. Presence and availability here providing the preconditions for what we might call rather unfashionably these days an encounter, something in which both parties are involved and during which both will be changed. I'm coming to the end now. The more the ideas of efficiency and output assert their supreme authority, says Marcel, the more the attitude of reverence towards the guest, towards the wounded, towards the sick, will appear at first incomprehensible and later absurd. And in fact, in the world around us, we know this assertion of the absurdity of forbearance and generosity is taking very practical shapes. Now, those words were written in 1951, but they seem to me to be just as relevant, if not more so, today. And actually, while I was writing this paper, I found myself feeling very ill at ease and anticipating there would be people here today who would feel that even the word hospitality in these days of recession and austerity, when the cash-strapped NHS is faltering, when there aren't enough doctors and nurses to go around, is absurd. And of course, in a wider political sense, It seems even more absurd at a time of Brexit, where the EU remains deeply wary of and resistant to receiving the migrant, the asylum seeker, the refugee. To expect and extend hospitality these days seem to be almost as absurd as Babette spending every last centime of her 10,000 francs on a fantastic meal for the sisters and their friends. And yet, said Derrida, this is the double law of hospitality. To calculate the risks, yes, but without closing the door on the incalculable, on the future and the foreigner. Sarah, for all her pots and pans, was an unlikely Babette, and yet the other, like the Messiah, says Derrida, must arrive whenever he or she wants. So I'm left with very uncomfortable questions about the personal and professional limits of my own hospitality. Did I really receive Sarah? How available was I prepared to make myself to the mystery of who she was, uncomfortable as that was? How much had I been willing to implicate, involve and engage myself rather than simply reduce her to the convenient category of a difficult or borderline patient, as did her psychiatrist? I can't absolve myself of personal responsibility for what I think of as a failed therapy, but in writing this paper I couldn't help asking myself what kind of hospitality can be provided when we work in an institution that embodies unavailability, that incarnates conditionality, and that promotes indifference, when we're part of a system that deals the poor, the marginalised, the homeless and the vulnerable such a tragic hand. Perhaps the beautiful parable of Babette reminds us of the obligation to practice hospitality despite its apparent impossibility. Practicing an ethics of hospitality is important for us as therapists, not because of any clinical outcomes that might be supposed to accrue, but because of the space it provides that might allow change to happen. As a therapist, I'm rather interested in what happens when I value presence over visibility, reception over rationality, and mysteries over problems. I don't think this is out of any sentimental idea of congeniality or coziness in the consulting room, nor out of any particular dislike of numbers and statistics, but rather because of what I think a robust and consistent ethics of hospitality might yield, what it might allow, encourage or inspire, what it might transform. I think Dinesen shows us something about hospitality in her tale of Babette by drawing on the ancient craft of storytelling, a craft that Walter Benjamin reminds us is dying out in the age of information, in the age of visibility. Its counterpart in the theatre of indifference is the rapid, vapid discourse of the strapline and the soundbite. But the psychotherapist, like the storyteller, I think is an artisan, slowly gathering up the raw material of our own and others' lives into the household of story, fashioning it into something that is solid, useful, and unique. Like the storyteller, what we most have to offer is a hospitality of listening, a presence that is attentive not just to strangers, but to strange ideas and stories, an availability not just to foreigners, but to foreign feelings and fantasies, a receptiveness not just to the dispossessed, but to the unthought, unvoiced, exiled parts of ourselves and others. And this hospitality of listening, I think, is our responsibility as psychotherapists. But I want to finish today just by returning once more to the question of what it might mean to sustain such a stance in the NHS's theatre of indifference, where the commodification of care, the performance of presence, and an availability that is more apparent than actual is what receives attention and, of course, funding. I think we know our professional responsibilities are constantly being eclipsed by the requirement to maximise output. that we're finding it ever more difficult to sustain the kind of clinical work we're trained to do, the kind of work that acknowledges the significance to the client of those things that lie further back in time and deeper down in the domain of human hearts. If, as Derrida suggests, hospitality really only begins to happen when we press up against its limits, if it only begins to happen when we feel the edge loses its excess, how can we even begin to think about practicing an ethics of hospitality in today's NHS? Well, I think I have to leave that question there for you guys. Thank you very much for listening.